The weight of what has been discussed, the fleeting discipline of the moment, the gentle challenge to self-judgment, the struggle against the stories we tell ourselves about our past, it settles upon the spirit like a thick, unbreathable fog. One assumes that knowledge should be cumulative, that if enough great minds have walked these paths before us, then perhaps somewhere along the way lies a neatly labeled instruction manual for living well. Yet, standing here, surrounded by echoes of thought from epochs long past, the conclusion is anything but certain. It feels less like finding answers and more like realizing that questions are not solved, they merely shift shape. When we speak of Socrates' unexamined life, we understand the danger. To live without reflection, drifting through days guided only by habit or expectation. But perhaps the true burden lies not in forgetting how to question, but in accepting that every single answer offered, whether it is the rigorous discipline of the Stoics, the systematic logic of Aristotle, or the profound self-acceptance we sought with the river, is itself a temporary guidepost, and therefore merely points toward another unknown vista. The spirit craves resolution. It demands a final thesis statement for the chaotic masterpiece that is human existence. We are taught to find peace by restricting our desires, or by aligning ourselves with nature's impartial flow, or by diligently building virtuous habits day by painstaking day. These were all powerful antidotes meant for specific poisons: anxiety, hubris, emotional turmoil. But what happens when the poison changes? What happens when the internal conflict is not a single acute crisis, a loss, a moment of weakness, but rather an unending, subtle hum, a low-grade dissonance that permeates everything, making commitment feel like exhausting effort and joy feel suspiciously transient? The initial doubt whispers loudly. Does philosophy promise freedom, or merely establish another sophisticated cage built of perfectly reasoned concepts? If I am told to accept fate, am I truly free? And if I am taught to act with virtue consistently, am I not simply obeying a historical protocol, rather than embracing authentic being? These questions are slippery, refusing to settle into comfortable categories. They swim in the space between one great school of thought and the next. The journey has been one of dismantling things: the ego, the judgment, the resistance to what is. But perhaps the deepest work, the most terrifying and necessary kind of wisdom, is realizing that the act of deconstruction must become its own end goal. The search for a single, overarching truth, a cosmic law that dictates perfect living, is itself a profound error in philosophical architecture. It presupposes that reality is static enough to be captured by one unifying principle. And yet, if there is no central truth, nothing binds us together. If all philosophy merely ends with the gentle suggestion of asking better questions, then what does that suggest about our fundamental human need for narrative? We are storytellers, at our core. We organize chaos into character arcs. Struggle leads to triumph. Suffering yields wisdom. Philosophy often feels like an attempt to write a perfect conclusion, a neat final chapter where all loose threads tie up with satisfying symmetry. But life, the lived experience that transcends any syllabus or ancient inscription, is inherently messy. It resists closure. The most profound moments are those interstitial voids. The quiet 5 minutes after solving a monumental problem, when the euphoria hasn't fully set in, and the worry about what comes next has not yet begun. It is in these indeterminate spaces that true wisdom resides. The philosophical journey therefore becomes less of an ascent toward a single peak labeled understanding, and more like navigating a vast, windswept plain. The wind blows from every direction, from the certainty sought by those who codified great laws, from the deep skepticism of the radical questioners, and even from the quiet acceptance taught by embracing natural indifference. All these directions are valid, all these perspectives necessary, yet none can fully contain the totality of being. The breakthrough does not arrive as a blinding flash or a glorious realization, but rather as a subtle reduction in internal noise. It is the moment when you stop trying to balance on the tips of opposing philosophical theories, the Stoic rigor against the Buddhist letting go, the Platonic ideal against the absurdist embrace of chaos. Instead, you simply exist in the synthesis, the quiet recognition that these debates are not battle lines, but rather adjacent rooms within a single, immense house called life. The task is no longer to choose the way. It is to be adaptable enough to thrive in the ambiguity itself. It requires recognizing that self-mastery is not achieved by adopting an absolute system of thought, but by cultivating a fluid intellectual capacity, a willingness to hold contradictory ideas gently within the mind without collapsing into paralysis or dogma. This continuous act of questioning, this unending debate about what it means to be human, is not merely homework for the academy. It is the very texture of being alive. The whisper of doubt did not shatter certainty. Instead, it revealed that certainty itself was just one narrative among millions, each equally fragile and brilliantly beautiful in its limited scope. And in accepting that infinite spectrum of possibility, the ongoing debate, we finally gain a true form of freedom, the freedom to be imperfectly, beautifully unsure. We have journeyed through the whispers of countless ages. We have wrestled with doubt and confronted the powerful illusion that life demands a single, definitive answer. We learn that certainty is often merely comfort, and true wisdom resides in the willingness to hold contradiction, to exist within the embrace of ambiguity itself. The mind, it seems, craves closure, but the human spirit thrives on the endless inquiry. If philosophy is not a destination, then what is it? It is revealed that it is a practice, a demanding discipline, like breathing or walking, an act performed moment by moment, often unnoticed until it ceases entirely. Our path has led us to question reality itself. Was our world always as stable as we assume? We began with the great seeds of doubt laid down by those Pre-Socratics who dared ask why and how this existence actually worked. They planted the seed of fundamental questioning, suggesting that everything perceived must first be meticulously observed. The ancient mind understood that to exist was to debate, to observe was to judge, and judgment, however well-intentioned, carries a heavy cost. It requires us to categorize, to label things as good or bad, true or false. But what if the very act of labeling is what restricts our ability to truly see? What if some experiences defy simple binaries? This realization guides us toward the stern, practical discipline of Stoicism, the art of choosing your battles. It taught us a profound shift in focus, that the deepest locus of human control does not lie in manipulating external events, but in governing our internal reaction to those things. We cannot stop rain from falling, nor can we force another person to feel authentic empathy for us. These are realms governed by fate and other wills. Yet, we retain absolute sovereignty over one crucial area, the judgment that passes through the mind when these things happen. The Stoics were not advocates for emotional apathy. They advocated for clear sight. They taught that much of our suffering is voluntary. We choose to amplify minor setbacks into existential crises. We take a small moment of frustration, perhaps from a spilled cup or a harsh word, and we build an entire narrative around it. I am incompetent. My day is ruined. This person hates me. This narrative, this judgment, is the source of unnecessary pain. It is the self-inflicted wound that requires no physical action to occur. This discipline of choosing battles manifests as a relentless practice of psychological triage. When we encounter chaos in our lives, a career setback, a relational conflict, a sudden moment of injustice, the immediate, reactive impulse is often to fight everything, to argue every point, to reorganize every perceived failure, to fix the flawed environment at all costs. The Stoic pause demands something far harder, the recognition of what cannot and should not be controlled. Think of it as drawing a precise boundary around your inner peace. On one side are the winds, the tides, the unreliable nature of human expectation. On the other is the calm space reserved for your own ascent. You must learn to let the first group buffet against the second without penetrating its stillness. This is not resignation. It is strategic withdrawal. It is understanding that by refusing to grant full moral authority to every irritation, every slight, every unexpected disappointment, you reclaim immense psychic power. The practice requires mindfulness applied with military precision. When faced with a petty annoyance, an unproductive burst of anger fueled by inconvenience, the instinct is to react instantly and forcefully. The Stoic discipline whispers a counter-argument. Pause. Ask yourself, is this worth my energy? Does reacting right now solve anything concrete in the physical world, or does it merely create more emotional residue for me to sweep up later? Often, the answer reveals that the most powerful action is inaction, the disciplined non-engagement. This focus on internal ascent led us further into the realm of acceptance. We saw how fighting against what is fundamentally depletes the energy needed to improve what can be. To constantly struggle against gravity is pointless. One simply learns the grace and efficiency of falling with it, using that resistance not as a defeat, but as a vector for change. The true mastery emerges when you stop defining your life by the list of things that went wrong. Instead, you define yourself by the consistent pattern of internal resilience, the ability to navigate setback without abandoning one's core principles. It is the difference between being defined by external events and choosing definition through unwavering character. This discipline is not merely coping. It is the construction of an unbreakable inner citadel. The journey shows us that life's great philosophies do not offer spells or secret knowledge to eliminate suffering entirely. Instead, they provide frameworks for viewing suffering as predictable friction, as necessary resistance, and ultimately as material for training your own magnificent self-control. The art is learning the gentle yet firm refusal to engage in battles that were never truly yours to fight. We have spent time learning how to control our reactions to the world outside. We learn to reserve our strength for what truly matters, choosing our battles wisely in the face of external chaos. But wisdom is not merely about managing external inputs. It demands a profound and often uncomfortable mastery over something much smaller, yet far more powerful, the landscape within ourselves. The hardest battleground, ultimately, is the space between your ear and your throat, the space where judgment forms into criticism. For too long, we have taken the critical voice of our inner self as gospel. We treat it like an external force, a genuine warning system that must be obeyed without question. It tells us when we falter, when we speak poorly, when we achieve little enough. And so, we become prisoners to its pronouncements. This inner critic whispers insidious doubts into the quiet hours, amplifying every small mistake until it feels like fundamental failure. It judges not just the action, but the essence of our being. It asks us, are you good enough? Was that sufficient? You are wrong to treat this critical voice as truth itself. The first step toward freedom is realizing that criticism is rarely an objective report of reality. More often, it is merely unexamined fear given a convincing voice and dressed up in the clothes of certainty. The critic thrives on assumptions, filling gaps in our understanding with worst-case scenarios. It latches onto potential failings, the paths not taken, the words left unspoken, and rebuilds them into damning evidence against us. This self-inflicted judgment is exhausting. It keeps us locked in a perpetual state of defense, forever apologizing for who we are or what we might have been. Consider this voice. It demands perfection. It suggests that if one error occurs, the whole structure must collapse. But life, by its nature, is messy. It is replete with moments of struggle and inefficiency. And yet, when we accept the imperfection of our own human condition, the simple fact that we are fallible beings operating in a chaotic world, a profound lightness begins to emerge. To challenge this inner judge is not an act of self-indulgent rebellion. It is one of supreme intellectual discipline. It requires us to step back and become objective observers of our own minds. When the critical thought arises, we must practice a radical act of suspension, simply noticing it without immediately accepting its premise or adopting its emotional weight. We learn to say to that voice something simple yet profoundly powerful. I hear you, but hearing is not agreeing. This separation creates necessary distance. It reminds us that the thought itself is only a transient electrical event in the mind. It has no inherent truth value until we validate it with our judgment. When we treat the criticism as merely data, a pattern of neural firing, perhaps triggered by fatigue or unresolved trauma, its immediate power dissipates. It becomes just noise, not destiny. The work then shifts from controlling actions to interrogating thought patterns. Why is this particular flaw so threatening? What does this judgment protect us from? Often, the deepest-seated criticism is simply a misplaced attempt at control, a terrified grasping at predicted futures that never arrive. The critic tries to keep us safe by making us small, predictable, and perpetually remorseful. We must gently dismantle these narratives of inadequacy. We are not defined by our worst mistake, nor are we even completely defined by the aggregate sum of all those mistakes. Our identity is far broader than the narrative constructed by a self-critical inner judge. It includes resilience, curiosity, joy in simple moments, and the capacity for genuine learning. These elements resist easy categorization or condemnation. This process demands immense patience, much like tending to fragile ground after a harsh storm. We cannot expect immediate silence from that judgmental voice. Sometimes, it will resurface with old accusations, armed with nostalgic bitterness. In those moments, we must meet the criticism not with argument, for debate only validates its presence, but with gentle acknowledgement and redirection. An acceptance of the flaw without letting the flaw define us. That is the subtle art. The gap between who you are when the inner critic speaks and who you know yourself to be beneath the echo of that voice. Closing that gap is the greatest philosophical achievement. We have spent time examining the external world, the ethics of action, the discipline of routine, the stillness found in nature. But perhaps we overlook the terrain closest to us, the landscape of our own telling stories. We are accustomed to viewing failure and mistakes as factual data points, simply things that happened. Yet, philosophy insists that this view is incomplete and often profoundly misleading. It suggests a crucial distinction must be drawn between what happened to us and the narrative we insist on attaching to it. This difference is perhaps the hardest wisdom of all, for our memories are rarely objective. They are crafted narratives, woven with judgment and assumed consequence. For years, We have treated ourselves as merely collections of experiences, a set of triumphs mixed with predictable scars. We believed that if we could just accumulate enough good actions, or master enough routines, or avoid enough mistakes, our self-worth would follow suit. But the depth of introspection shows us something more subtle and far more challenging. The deepest wound often comes not from an event itself, the loss, the insult, the failure, but from the story we choose to tell ourselves about that event. It is the story that constructs a permanent character flaw, whispering a verdict on who we inherently are, inadequate, predictable, or doomed to repeat the cycle. This fabricated narrative, this self-imposed sentence, possesses far more power and destructive capacity than the original incident itself. The mind has an inherent need for coherence. It abhors ambiguity. When confronted with the messy reality of imperfect action, it races to create a neat label. A simplistic story is comforting. I messed up because I am careless. She insulted me because I lack dignity. These labels grant a sense of predictable order to chaos. But this perceived order comes at a terrible cost. By accepting these limiting narratives, we willingly cage ourselves. We allow the judgment, the persistent always and never, to eclipse the reality of the moment-by-moment becoming. This is the subtle, seductive trap where ego mistakes definition for destiny. Consider a profound mistake made years ago, a missed opportunity, a relationship that faltered, a decision poorly executed under pressure. The raw failure was merely an action taken by a flawed human being at a specific time and place. It exists in the past, inert like fallen rock. But what lives in our minds is not the event. It is the interpretation of that event, the persistent because I am fundamentally incapable attached to it. That attached story becomes the operating system for future choices, coloring every interaction with a pre-written sense of guilt or inherent deficiency. The past mistake stops being a chapter we read and starts becoming the title of our entire book. The burden here is monumental, to practice radical intellectual separation. We must learn to observe thoughts as mere passing electrical impulses, not as sacred declarations of truth. When the inner critic begins its routine, the whisper that reminds us how disastrous everything will be, or why we are perpetually misunderstood, we must catch it. Not by arguing with the criticism, for argument only fuels the cycle, but by acknowledging it gently and neutrally. We treat it like background noise, a thought passing through the mind's hall, devoid of any inherent authority or factual weight. This separation is not simply remembering that you are bigger than your failures. It is an active, daily intellectual resistance. It requires treating self-identity as something fluid and perpetually under construction, rather than as a fixed monument built upon past shortcomings. The real struggle is convincing the heart, which always seeks patterns and certainties, that life offers no permanent definition. Our essence is not defined by our worst actions, but by our capacity to witness those actions without collapsing into judgment. We are the awareness that observes the flaw, more than we are the flaw itself. This realization frees us from the paralyzing conviction of being eternally the person who failed at X, allowing us instead to simply be the conscious agent navigating uncertainty. This act, this constant separating of who I am from what happened, is where true wisdom resides. It pulls us out of the gravitational pull of narrative determinism and anchors us in the unwritten potential of the present breath. The past was merely input data. The future remains an unknown variable. Our mastery is therefore located solely within the radical, compassionate acceptance that we are fundamentally non-fixed beings, a process of continuous becoming, capable of revising the story whenever the willingness to observe the truth over the comfort of a lie emerges. We have spent this journey learning to observe the currents of thought. We have learned where true strength resides, not in forcing outcomes, but in mastering our internal landscape. Our previous pursuits focused intensely on building walls between ourselves and external chaos, walls between who we are and what we mistake for criticism. But these structures, however solid they feel, begin to prove insufficient against the persistent flow of life itself. We are naturally drawn to the illusion of control, believing that if we just push hard enough or organize our thoughts perfectly enough, the world will finally bend to our will. It is a deeply human desire, the need for predictability in an unpredictable cosmos. Yet, look now at this river. Look how it simply moves. To resist its flow is to expend energy against physics itself. It is exhausting, futile work that only leads to greater fatigue. This small stream flowing over the stones represents much of our deepest struggle with existence. We view life's natural tendencies, the change, the loss, the unpredictability of other people, as obstacles that must be contained or diverted. We pick up imaginary dams and spend our precious reserves trying to redirect water that has always been going where it needs to go. The paradox is this. In our desperate attempt to grip and command everything around us, we lose something far more vital than simple peace. We sacrifice the very essence of freedom, the effortless flow, at the altar of imagined safety. Mastery, we have come to understand, is not about controlling the river. It is about understanding its nature. It is accepting that resistance is merely a form of self-inflicted pain. To fight the current is to argue with reality itself. We are conditioned from childhood to solve problems, to impose order, and to fix everything that seems broken or out of place. This impulse, while helpful in emergencies, becomes paralyzing when applied to the broad sweep of human experience. The world will not be rational simply because we wish it to be. Emotions flare without warning. People behave illogically. Catastrophes strike regardless of our meticulous planning. To try and predict these variables is a Sisyphean task for the mind. It requires us to carry a boulder uphill forever, knowing that the moment we pause, it rolls back down. The realization that true power lies in letting go is perhaps the hardest philosophical hurdle of all. It demands not merely an intellectual assent, a mere agreement made within the study of a great thinker, but a fundamental rewiring of the gut instinct. Letting go feels dangerous. It feels like giving up, like ceasing to care enough to fight for what we value. Yet, it is precisely in that voluntary surrender, the release of grip on outcomes, on narratives, and on people, that freedom truly blooms. Consider the difference between wishing a storm would stop and accepting that its weather pattern simply is at this moment. One is resistance, steeped in fear. The other is profound acceptance, rooted in presence. Acceptance does not mean apathy or indifference. Quite the contrary. It means seeing reality clearly enough to know what needs immediate action, and crucially, knowing what must be observed without needing to change it. This sophisticated form of mastery requires a deep shift in focus, from attempting to control external variables, the career, the relationship, the economic climate, to mastering the singular domain we actually possess, our response, our assent, the small internal space between stimulus and reaction. We are not freed by altering the river. We are free when we adjust how we stand on its bank. This shift is profound because it asks us to exchange the monumental effort of governing the external world for the sustainable, steady practice of self-regulation. It moves from a philosophy of action, where success is measured by what we achieve against resistance, to a philosophy of observation. We become skillful at watching the water flow, understanding its patterns, and acknowledging its raw power without needing to tame it into our personal desires. This is not resignation. It is intellectual maturity. It is recognizing the limits of human agency while expanding the scope of internal virtue. The freedom we seek was never found in the perfection of circumstance, but always resided within the quiet resilience of the mind that witnessed the circumstance exactly as it was. Learning to breathe with the rhythm of the river, when it swells and when it recedes, is the deepest lesson philosophy can offer us on the path to true peace. The journey has been one of retreat, a careful withdrawal from the certainty of simple answers. We have learned that discipline is not merely resisting external temptations. It is the deep work of mastering our internal ascent. We saw how to deconstruct the harshest critic within us and understood the essential separation between what happened in the past and the story we continue to tell ourselves about those events. The greatest freedom, perhaps, was accepting the river's flow, the understanding that true mastery comes not from diverting circumstances, but from ceasing the futile struggle against reality itself. This profound acceptance felt like a fragile plateau of peace, yet even on that height, the whispers persisted. The question marks remained overhead, reminding us that this internal quietude is not an end point. It is simply a necessary moment of breath. We stood at the precipice of modern understanding, armed with tools for self-regulation and detachment. But to think that such knowledge could provide immunity from doubt was profound arrogance. The philosophical tradition, vast as the Mediterranean, always reminds us of the starting point, fundamental confusion. It compels us back, not with a lecture, but with the elemental shock of foundational questions. Who are we? What is this reality we perceive through our senses? How does existence operate when stripped bare of all assumption? These were the burning engines that fueled the earliest minds. The Pre-Socratics did not have our language of psychology or ethics. Their focus was on the raw substance of being. They looked at the sky, the water, and the earth, asking what singular principle governed it all, a logos, a breath, an underlying fire. Doubt, in this context, was not a personal failing. It was the necessary spark that ignited civilization itself. It was the most radical intellectual act, to question the accepted myth, the local custom, or the divine edict. To say, wait, what if? The weight of these foundational queries pressed upon the spirit. How does one live when the bedrock beneath your understanding is perpetually shifting? The subsequent epochs built elaborate systems upon these shaky foundations. Plato seeking perfect forms beyond sensory confusion. Aristotle classifying everything tangible into neat categories. Each system was a magnificent structure erected precisely to quell the deep, primal anxiety generated by the pre-Socratic uncertainty. They sought stability, certainty, and universal laws, but this craving for absolute definition proved to be perhaps philosophy's greatest shared vulnerability. The internal struggle, therefore, became one of historical perspective, recognizing that our own self-doubt, the lingering questioning about identity or moral judgment, is merely an echo of the ancient philosophical mandate. We are participants in an unending debate, inheriting not answers, but the brilliant tradition of suspicion. To be genuinely thoughtful is to accept that every conviction, no matter how beautifully articulated, stands on ground that can and must be questioned. The seeds sown by those earliest philosophers, Thales pointing to water, Heraclitus insisting on constant change, Parmenides arguing for immutable being, were not mere academic exercises. They were attempts to build a cohesive narrative of reality itself, giving humanity the first vocabulary with which to process its bewildering existence. This origin story is therefore vital. It teaches us that doubt is fundamentally an act of profound curiosity. It is not a weakness. It is intellectual muscle memory. To question is simply to participate in the grand, ongoing conversation about what it means to be conscious on this rotating sphere. And the most valuable lesson we carry forward from these debates, from the Pre-Socratics to Socrates and beyond, is humility. We must understand that true wisdom lies not in having mastered a single system or resolving the ultimate nature of reality. It resides instead in the continuous, fluid comfort of standing with the question mark, ready to follow the next compelling doubt wherever it leads, recognizing that the journey itself is the only fixed point. The grand debates of history often fill us with the illusion that truth is a single object, waiting to be discovered and captured. We search for the master equation, the ultimate theory that will finally settle every dispute about existence, justice, or the nature of man. But after confronting the depths of doubt, we learn a different truth. Wisdom does not arrive as a sudden flash of perfect understanding. It emerges slowly, through repetition, through the disciplined attention paid to small, mundane moments. If life's great answers are vast and overwhelming, then perhaps true mastery is found in mastering the immediate moment. The modern philosopher, having traversed these mighty intellectual peaks and valleys, arrives at a simple routine. It is not a dramatic quest for enlightenment, but rather the quiet act of preparation. This morning ritual becomes a metaphor for the mind's architecture, a deliberate exercise in building resilience brick by small, conscious brick. Like Marcus Aurelius facing the demands of an empire, we are taught that our greatest struggles are often simply miniature versions of the challenges to come. The practice begins before the sun has fully risen. It is a time of stillness, when the world outside has not yet imposed its noise and urgency upon us. The first discipline is observation, noticing the weight of the duvet, the cool touch of morning air on bare skin, the scent of damp earth. These are simply facts, raw sensory data, stripped clean of interpretation or judgment. We learn to sit with these simple realities without the need to narrate them or assign emotional value. The body becomes a vessel for mindfulness. It is taught that resistance only creates discomfort. The act of journaling takes on profound philosophical weight. It is not merely recording events, but meticulously cataloging internal arguments. What complaints does the mind conjure upon waking? What anticipatory anxieties about the day ahead surface before conscious thought can even organize them? We are tasked with observing these initial mental impulses, the fear of failure, the resentment of others, the irritation at a perceived slight, as mere fleeting data points. They are treated not as immutable truths, but as drafts of thoughts yet to be judged. This disciplined self-inventory is fundamentally Stoic. It recognizes that our discomfort rarely springs from external events themselves. Rather, it springs from the story we tell ourselves about those events. The difficulty of the day, a challenging meeting, a frustrating conversation, an unexpected setback, is simply a blank canvas awaiting pigment. Our immediate reaction, our assent to the complaint or the fear, is the paint itself. By journaling these raw, unexamined reactions, we create distance between the stimulus and the response. We learn to see that merely noticing the urge to complain diminishes its power. Consider the subtle architecture of judgment. Every time a critical thought surfaces, the belief that someone has slighted you, or that you are inadequate for a certain role, it is not an objective assessment of reality. It is a loaded conclusion drawn from incomplete emotional data. The routine teaches us to interrupt this flow of automatic assent. Instead of saying, "This happened, and it proves I am flawed," we learn the pause. I notice the thought that I am inadequate. This linguistic shift is nothing short of revolutionary. It changes the subject from a fixed state of being to a transient mental event. The challenge here is not intellectual understanding. Philosophy can teach us what assent is and why withholding it leads to tranquility. The true struggle, as Marcus reminds us, lies in the moment itself, the sudden, unavoidable emotional surge in the midst of chaos. Resilience, therefore, is built through practice. It is like physical training. One does not become strong by contemplating strength. One becomes strong by enduring discomfort and repeatedly choosing a measured response over an immediate outburst. The morning routine thus serves as a microcosm for life's inevitable trials. When we confront the day's potential difficulties, a demanding boss, financial strain, relational conflict, we carry with us the habit of this self-observation. We are trained to assume that our primary enemy is not the world around us, but the internal narrative machine running unchecked within our own minds. The goal shifts from achieving happiness, which is fickle and dependent on externals, to cultivating apatheia, or freedom from disturbing passions. It means becoming emotionally unattached to outcomes that are not solely under your control. This approach demands a radical acceptance of impermanence, mirrored in the gentle passing light across the floor. Everything changes. Our moods, our circumstances, the political landscape, even our physical bodies. To cling to any specific state, the feeling of stability, the memory of success, or the hope for future peace, is to set oneself up for profound disappointment. The wise mind embraces this fluidity, understanding that growth is not a straight line toward a final answer, but a meandering path defined by continuous adaptation and self-correction. The small moments become monumental laboratories. A difficult walk becomes an examination of patience. Waiting in line becomes a lesson in accepting forced idleness. These mundane experiences are reframed as opportunities for spiritual rigor. We stop treating these moments as mere interruptions to our goals and start seeing them as the very structure of life's curriculum. The philosophical debate thus never ends. It simply changes its scope from abstract concepts, such as being or nothingness, to the immediate domain of self. How do I choose my judgment right now? What is the most disciplined response to this minor inconvenience? This transformation, from grand theory to micro-action, represents perhaps the deepest wisdom available. That true freedom is not found by solving the universe's mysteries, but by mastering the small patch of ground beneath your own conscious attention. We have spent our time learning resilience from the smallest moments. We learned that true power does not reside in predicting outcomes or controlling external forces, but in mastering the landscape of our own mind. That mastery is often misunderstood. It is not about building walls around ourselves against the world's perceived threat. On the contrary, Stoicism teaches a kind of delicate neutrality, a skill of detachment. The challenge now is to face something chaotic, something vast and uncontrollable. Look at the storm or consider the unexpected shift in fortune. Life constantly presents us with stimuli, a setback, an injustice, a wave of intense emotion, and our immediate default setting is to judge it. We immediately attach meaning. This failure means I am inadequate. This loss proves that life is unfair. This instant, emotional verdict is what gives external events their power over us. We must train ourselves to pull back from that initial rush of judgment, to observe the stimulus without automatically assigning blame or defining meaning. The core struggle here is not resisting emotion, but seeing its mechanism. When we feel a sudden wave of despair, for instance, the goal is not to magically feel better. It is simply to notice, ah, this feeling has arrived. I am noticing a powerful sense of lack. This observation itself creates distance. This separation allows us to understand that emotion is rarely a reflection of objective reality. Instead, emotions are strong judgments about external things, colored by our expectations and needs. We are not affected by the storm. We are affected by the judgment that the storm represents failure or danger or irreparable loss. The intensity of our pain is directly proportional to the severity of the unexamined narrative we wrap around that event. The training becomes one of constant de-escalation. When faced with difficulty, rather than immediately reacting with defensive certainty, we learn to pause and apply a simple query. What judgment am I making right now? Is this feeling stating a fact, or is it merely expressing my disappointment that reality deviated from expectation? This practice demands tremendous mental discipline because our instinct is always toward reaction. We want to fight the injustice. We want to solve the problem immediately. Detachment feels like emotional surrender, but in truth, it is profound personal empowerment. It is refusing to hand over your inner peace as a bargaining chip for the illusion of control. Imagine the neutral observer standing outside a heated debate. They do not take sides because they recognize that the true fight is not between arguments A and B, but within the participant who desperately needs their beliefs to be validated. By observing all viewpoints, even those passionately opposed to us, with genuine intellectual neutrality, we begin to see the common ground, humanity's universal pattern of fear and aspiration. The life itself becomes a grand philosophical experiment in emotional triage. We practice withholding assent. When an irrational thought screams at us that something terrible is about to happen, instead of accepting it as gospel truth, as if reading a prophecy carved in stone, we treat it as merely data. It is just electricity moving through the wires of the brain, nothing more binding than a random passing cloud. This sustained neutrality is radical. It means cultivating an emotional immunity. It does not mean that we become cold or uncaring. Rather, it means that our caring remains entirely centered on what is within our scope of influence, our choices, our attention, and the quality of our internal assent. The external world may remain chaotic, a swirling vortex of unpredictable events, but the inner citadel, the self, becomes unbreachable by mere feeling. Embracing neutrality is thus not a passive acceptance. It is an active philosophical stance. It is choosing to meet the force of life's inherent unpredictability with intellectual poise and emotional spaciousness. We learn that the greatest freedom is found precisely at the intersection where judgment ceases, where expectation fades, and where all we are left with is the pristine reality of the present moment. The ability simply to be, observed without attachment, untainted by need or fear. And in that sustained quiet observation, a profound peace emerges. Not the high, dramatic triumph of overcoming an obstacle, but the deep, continuous resonance of knowing you are unshakable, not because nothing will ever change outside of you, but because you have mastered the self, the most volatile and powerful terrain of all. We have spent time examining the self, in isolation. We mastered our inner critics, learned to accept external flow, and understood that true power resides not in absolute control, but in the thoughtful choosing of one's internal assent. Yet, we quickly discovered that the human spirit is not a solitary endeavor. Every thought, every action, every struggle for peace finds its immediate context within another person. Philosophy, up until now, had been an exercise in self-management, a deep dive into the personal citadel of consciousness. But man is fundamentally meant to exist within a community. Our being echoes off the walls of others. This is where the true complexity of philosophy must confront the messy, vibrant reality of human interaction. Think about it. We can achieve perfect internal peace on our own meditations. We can manage the whispers of doubt and withstand the judgment of our past selves. But how does that inner resilience survive the gaze of another person? How do we navigate disagreement without retreating into comforting self-isolation? The greatest philosophical debates, perhaps, are not those fought within the quiet chambers of a mind at dawn, but in the charged space between two opposing will. We have always treated others like mere variables in our personal equations of virtue. But they are not variables. They are embodied complexities, full of their own fears, their own unexamined assumptions, and their own needs for validation. The concept of self-mastery, which has been our sole focus, now requires an outward expansion. It asks us to redefine what it means to be truly free when surrounded by the inevitable demands and expectations of others. This necessary shift is perhaps harder than mastering any internal vice. We must learn that intellectual purity in solitude often struggles against emotional entropy in company. The community acts as a mirror, but unlike the gentle reflection we trained ourselves to accept, this mirror sometimes screams our flaws back at us. It can challenge the fragile equilibrium built by years of rigorous self-observation. Consider the nature of ethics itself. For so long, we have defined virtue primarily through Stoic resignation, a quiet acceptance of what cannot be changed within your own sphere of influence. Our focus has been on managing assent and minimizing emotional disturbance. But many great ethical traditions suggest that the purest form of human flourishing, the eudaimonia, is inherently social. It requires participation. It demands giving something up for the sake of something larger than oneself, the community, justice, or another person's welfare. This creates a profound tension. The perfect self-mastery advocated by some philosophies risks dissolving when confronted with genuine human need. If my greatest virtue is maintaining inner detachment, what happens to that detachment when someone I care about suffers deeply because of my inaction? Furthermore, if my peace depends only on controlling my internal judgment, my assent, am I morally culpable for the suffering of others whose judgments or actions spill over into mine? We are forced now to bridge the gap between absolute self-preservation and active communal responsibility. This is where individual bliss meets ethical obligation, and it forms the core friction point of our existence. It is a dialectic that demands we stop treating character as an internal product and start viewing it as an enacted relationship. The wisdom gained from solitude taught us how to weather storms internally. Now, we must learn how to navigate the unpredictable weather systems created by others' lives, beliefs, and agendas. This expansion requires vulnerability, the very thing self-mastery has often encouraged us to minimize or even fear. To genuinely engage with a community means accepting risk. The risk of disappointment, the risk of conflict, the risk that our best intentions will fail to move another person's heart. It means acknowledging that while we can control our own inner assent, we cannot guarantee the outcomes in others' lives, nor can we control their ability or willingness to accept what is offered. The great lesson here shifts from self-sufficiency to interdependence. True self-mastery emerges not when I perfect myself for my own sake, but when I learn how to perfectly participate in the flawed, beautiful chaos of shared human life. It means understanding that sometimes being right or being peaceful internally must yield to the necessity of empathy, even if that empathy disrupts our carefully constructed emotional boundaries. We are continually negotiating between the quiet perfection promised by disciplined withdrawal and the messy fulfillment offered by deep connection. The challenge is to find a third space, a realm where individual integrity does not become an isolated fortress, but rather a stable foundation from which one can engage responsibly with the world outside. It requires us to redefine freedom, not as freedom from others' judgment or demands, but as the disciplined ability to remain authentically oneself, while wholly contributing to the collective well-being. This continuous negotiation, this constant give and take between what I need and what you need, is the most profound gymnasium for the soul. And so, we confront the inescapable fact that self-knowledge inevitably leads us not back into quiet contemplation, but into the difficult, necessary work of being truly human with other humans. Our journey remains unfinished because humanity itself remains an unresolved question. We have spent our time examining the internal self. We learn to observe the fleeting judgments that give rise to distress, practicing the gentle art of detachment from outcome. We found peace not in controlling external forces, but in mastering the subtle ascent of our own minds. Yet, contemplation alone is not enough. Philosophy cannot remain solely within the quiet chambers of thought. It must leave those walls and enter the messy reality of human action. If wisdom is an intellectual achievement, where does it take root? We began to feel the pull away from the abstract theories towards something more tangible, more muscular, habit. We reached a critical impasse in our journey. We understood what not to do, the unnecessary worry, the emotional overreaction, the refusal to accept impermanence. But understanding is merely knowledge. It is passive. To truly become free, we must move beyond knowing and towards becoming. And this movement takes us directly to Aristotle. His teaching introduces a profoundly practical perspective. That character is not something you simply discover within yourself one day, like finding a lost treasure. Instead, Aristotle asserts that character is something built, brick by painstaking brick, through repeated action. It is not an innate gift, it is a cultivated habit. The self, in this view, is not found, it is constructed. The notion of virtue therefore shifts from being a state of mind to becoming a patterned way of life, a deep, ingrained behavioral muscle memory. Think of the disciplined warrior, whose ability to stand firm in battle is not merely intellectual preparation, but a habit forged through constant drills and rigorous discipline. Their virtue is their routine. This realization marks a vital turning point in our understanding of self-mastery. We had focused so much on stopping negative thoughts, on restraining the inner critic or withholding assent, that we sometimes neglected the affirmative step. What should we be doing instead? If wisdom is the cessation of bad habits, then it must also be the active formation of good ones. The weight of this idea shifts our perspective entirely. It suggests that to be a more compassionate person tomorrow, you do not simply need to understand compassion conceptually. You must consistently act with kindness today, even when it is difficult or costly. Similarly, if we wish to conquer impatience, merely recognizing the symptoms in ourselves is insufficient. We must repeatedly choose patience, in small ways, measurable acts of waiting and restraint. The ancient texts are replete with this concept, that through habituation, we mold our ethical character. If we practice honesty when it costs us reputation, or if we practice temperance when every indulgence seems appealing, these actions do not just solve a single momentary crisis. They restructure the very architecture of who we believe ourselves to be. This is where the philosophy becomes less like reading a text and more like learning an art that requires repetition, feedback, failure, and recommitment. We must accept that becoming good is not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, grueling accumulation of small victories over our own natural inclinations. It means accepting the friction of practice. The struggle is fundamentally one of direction. When faced with temptation or hardship, we have two options: retreat into our old patterns, the knee-jerk reaction driven by fear, comfort, or ego, or consciously execute the virtuous habit that we are building. The gap between these two choices is where all philosophical action resides. Consider patience. It is not a single emotional state one can simply decide to feel. Rather, it is the habitual response to delay. It is choosing to wait for an answer instead of demanding it, or allowing a disagreement to play out completely rather than trying to win through premature interruption. Each small instance where we choose restraint over reaction strengthens the muscle memory of calm. This understanding provides a profound sense of hope mixed with rigorous accountability. The freedom we sought, the state of being unburdened by our past mistakes or future anxieties, is not granted us miraculously. It is earned in the moment through tireless repetition. We are building ourselves into beings who are inherently more difficult to harm because their moral framework has become resiliently habitual. The journey thus becomes a continuous commitment to ethical practice. The philosophy does not end with a grand pronouncement or an ultimate answer. It concludes by pointing us back to the beginning, to the immediate present moment, and demanding that we begin acting differently right now. It is in these small, deliberate acts, the remembering of our intention before speaking, the choosing of deep listening over interruption, the preference for integrity even when exposed, that we weave the true tapestry of a virtuous life. We build the self not by theorizing about it, but by doing the work required to make that theory a lived reality. Our wisdom is measured not by what we know, but by how consistently we choose to act. This continuous cycle of intention, action, and subsequent habituation is the ultimate philosophical pursuit. The path of self-mastery has led us to this place, to this moment of quiet clarity. We have built habits. We have learned to observe the subtle judgments that fuel our distress. And we have understood that true freedom resides not in external outcomes, but in the disciplined architecture of our own minds. But knowledge, like a perfect structure, requires constant maintenance, especially the knowledge of self. The cumulative lessons from the great thinkers, from Aristotle's habits to the deep resignation of acceptance, all point us toward one singular, unavoidable challenge: self-knowledge. We are faced now with Socrates' mirror. This is not merely a reflective pause, it is an interrogation. Standing before this polished surface, we see more than just our reflection. We see the layers of accumulated thought, the residue of every assumption we have ever accepted as truth simply because they felt comfortable. To look into these eyes is to ask the ultimate question: do you truly know yourself? Not merely what others observe in you, but the deepest mechanisms by which your own mind operates. The temptation is immense to accept a pleasant or convenient falsehood about who we are. It would be easier to believe that our struggles come from unavoidable circumstance, or that some external force governs our choices. The self-examination, however, demands brutal honesty. We must peel back the carefully constructed narratives we have built around ourselves since childhood, stories of victimhood, of missed opportunity, of necessary struggle. These are not simply facts. They are deeply persuasive myths that govern how we interpret every new stimulus. The first act of confronting this mirror is therefore an intellectual one. accepting ambiguity. We must acknowledge that there is no single philosophical system containing the entirety of our being. To seek a master theory to explain all our flaws or justify all our successes would be reductive, and ultimately untrue. Wisdom demands the embrace of contradiction, the simultaneous truth of seemingly opposing ideas. The challenge then becomes reconciling the disciplined action we learned in habit with the fluidity required by true self-knowledge. We know how to choose our battles and how to maintain virtuous habits day after day. But do we understand why those choices feel compelling? When we practice patience, is it genuinely because virtue calls us, or are we merely avoiding the discomfort of potential failure? The mirror does not judge. It simply reflects. It holds up your current understanding for its unbiased scrutiny. And what we find often causes a momentary panic, a sudden realization of how much we still operate on autopilot. We see instances where our responses are governed not by reasoned assent, but by deeply ingrained emotional patterns. The quick flash of defensiveness when criticized, or the immediate spiral into worry before any actual event has occurred. The depth of this self-confrontation reveals that philosophical understanding is less about acquiring answers and more about developing the precise muscle memory for doubt. It is learning to remain suspended in the not yet known state, to stop treating intellectual inquiry as a problem to be solved, but rather as a constant, ongoing posture of being. The pain of this examination is directly proportional to its virtue. It requires us to stand nakedly open, intellectually vulnerable, to any contradiction. We learn that much of what we consider our fixed self is actually a collaboration between our memories and our expectations. The mistakes are often not in the actions themselves, but in the belief that those actions fully define who we are forever. The true meaning of knowing oneself, as Socrates taught us, is confronting one's own ignorance and welcoming it. It means looking at a situation and admitting, I do not know enough about this to judge it with certainty. Therefore, my only appropriate action is disciplined observation and empathetic engagement. This capacity to suspend judgment in the face of complexity is perhaps the greatest philosophical achievement. We realize that the cost of avoiding self-examination, the unexamined life, is nothing less than a gradual erosion of genuine freedom. We trade authentic experience for comfortable certainty, trading responsiveness for predictable habit. The philosopher does not find solace by retreating into abstract theories. They step out and confront the messy reality, carrying the perpetual weight of doubt like a shield and a tool all at once. This continuous act of questioning, this perpetual mirroring, is itself the ultimate philosophy. It promises not final answers, but sustained intellectual vigilance. It gives us permission to be incomplete, to be unsure, and crucially, to remain profoundly alive in the messy fullness of being human. We have traveled far through the towering halls of ancient thought. We questioned determinism, we faced the judgment of our own minds, and we learned to treat external events as mere stimuli, detached from our internal assent. Our journey showed us that true freedom is not a destination reached by solving grand philosophical equations. It is instead a continuous way of relating to experience itself. If self-mastery has been built through disciplined action, the daily virtue, the choosing of the habit, then perhaps we are finally ready for the last remaining borderland, the space between moments. The mind, in its nature, is a time machine. It cannot exist fully only where it currently resides. Much of our anxiety, much of our suffering, stems from living partially in a future that has not yet arrived, or dwelling hauntingly on a past we cannot retrieve. We build narratives about what should have been, and equally powerful narratives about what must happen next. These temporal constructions are ghosts, vivid but insubstantial. They steal the immediacy of being. To be caught between yesterday's regret and tomorrow's fear is to live life at half speed, always drifting on an imaginary tide. The deep realization that anchors us now is this: reality resides only in the present moment. It is a vanishing point. It arrives fully formed and then immediately begins dissolving. The philosophy, therefore, becomes less about grand theory and more about focused attention. It demands presence. Presence is not merely an attitude. It is a radically disciplined focus of awareness. To be fully present means stripping away the pretense that we can manage or predict every emotional spike, every external disappointment, or every passing thought. It means accepting that life, like breath, has no pause button and no rewind function. The only thing truly available to us is the single, instant unfolding right now. This light on the skin, the subtle taste of salt in the air, the weight of a stone in our hand. This focused immersion can be found in any activity that demands total concentration. It might be the patient rhythm of carving wood, where attention must follow the grain. It might be the silent, careful act of listening to another person without formulating your rebuttal, or perhaps simply walking, noticing the unique scrape of one shoe on worn cobblestone at a time. When we engage in these tasks with deep awareness, something profound happens. The inner monologue, that persistent and nagging storyteller, begins to soften. It is often loudest when our attention is elsewhere, when all our mental energy is required by the task, be it kneading dough or mapping constellations in the afternoon sky. The space for worry simply shrinks. We enter what some call a flow state, where self-consciousness dissolves, and we are merely conduits of action. Time itself seems to warp. Moments stretch into deep pools of rich experience, yet they pass with impossible speed. The philosophy suggests that these moments of effortless immersion are not just pleasant diversions. They are the very practice of existential mastery. They train us in radical non-resistance to the current moment. We learn to let go of the should have been and the will be, accepting only the potent truth of the now. To embrace Carpe Diem, or seize the day, does not mean reckless abandon. It means a profoundly serious commitment to paying attention. It is choosing presence over prediction. It requires us to meet life not as an adversary to be controlled, but as raw material to be experienced wholly. The past exists only in memory and consequence. The future exists only as potential energy. Neither holds the substance of our existence. Our lives are woven from the luminous threads of continuous nows. When we dedicate ourselves entirely to what is at hand, to the texture, the light, the scent, the taste, we realize that the great debates, the endless struggles against fate or ethics, all lose their teeth. They fade into meaningful background noise. The final wisdom gathered from these ancient whispers is a profound act of humility and simple attention. It is the recognition that our most powerful freedom lies in ceasing to struggle against the flow, to let go of the need for fixed answers, to surrender the illusion of control over time, and to dedicate every conscious moment to fully inhabiting reality as it unfolds. This mindful engagement, this disciplined state of being utterly present, is perhaps the highest form of wisdom, simply existing with radical awareness. We have journeyed far from the grand pronouncements of ancient schools. We have explored Stoic discipline and the hard work of character building. We faced down the inner critic, learning to treat our negative thoughts not as truth, but merely as passing data. We learned that the past is a narrative we tell ourselves, and the future is merely an echo of fear. Mastery was found by surrendering the illusion of total control, recognizing that life flows regardless of our desperate wishes. Yet, there remains a lingering tension, a tendency to take everything so profoundly seriously. The weight of these grand ideas, the sheer magnitude of philosophical inquiry, had begun to settle on us like dust, making every internal thought feel consequential, monumental. We treated doubt as a profound crisis and acceptance as a deeply solemn achievement. But wisdom, perhaps, is not always weighty. Sometimes, it arrives with a surprising lightness. The deepest realization, we find, does not come from mastering some insurmountable external challenge, nor even from the grand synthesis of all historical thought. Rather, sometimes it surfaces through pure observation, in moments that feel almost absurdly trivial. The final great debate is perhaps the one between ourselves and our own inherent seriousness. We are so intent on being profound, on executing the perfect internal discipline, that we forget to simply be human, to intellectualize every slight annoyance, to analyze every casual failing. It becomes a self-imposed burden far heavier than any real obstacle could ever prove. The traveler stops near a simple fountain, watching children play nearby, their unrestrained energy creating a rhythmic chaos against the quiet dignity of the old stones. He watches himself observe them, his furrowed brow, the mental calculation determining the philosophical significance of every splash and laugh. The self-awareness is immediate and startling. He realizes he has constructed an elaborate drama around a very simple moment. The immense struggle to be thoughtful, to maintain perfect non-attachment, while simultaneously proving one's deep understanding of detachment, is itself a kind of performance. It carries its own dramatic weight, requiring constant intellectual effort and self-correction. This need to constantly prove one's enlightenment is perhaps the ultimate internal contradiction. This recognition brings not a fresh wave of solemn truth, but instead a subtle, almost involuntary lift at the corners of the mouth, a gentle loosening of the perpetual seriousness that had become our philosophical uniform. The deepest wisdom we come to understand is recognizing when the gravity we assign to an event far outweighs the actual substance of the event itself. Our own self-pity, our overblown interpretations of minor setbacks, or the dramatic scale we give to simple disagreements, these are merely poorly dressed narratives. They deserve nothing more than a glance and a soft, uncritical release. The greatest philosophy, perhaps, is knowing when you have achieved enough understanding to laugh at the pretension of your own thoughts, to see the monumental struggle for self-mastery not as a heroic quest against fate, but sometimes just as human melodrama played out in expensive contemplation. This shift in perspective allows us to momentarily step back from the high stakes. The waterfall still flows, the river still moves towards the sea, and our mistakes are still being made, but they no longer feel like defining tragedies. They become merely small, humorous moments in a vastly complicated, but ultimately amusing, human drama. We learn that true peace is found when we cease treating our daily lives as the backdrop for an epic philosophical tragedy. It is found instead in accepting the inherent absurdity and the delightful imperfection of simply existing. And sometimes, all it takes is recognizing one's own overreaction to find freedom again. We began this journey seeking answers. We traveled through the whispers of doubt and met the stern discipline of the Stoics, learning that control must start within. We faced the inner critic, only to discover that our most feared judgments were merely echoes of unexamined thoughts. We wrestled with the stories we tell ourselves about failure, learning to separate the event from the narrative. The great gift was recognizing the futility of fighting a flowing river, realizing that true mastery comes not from altering reality, but from mastering the ascent, the agreement we give to our own perceptions. This chain of understanding led us deep into history, back to the pre-Socratic questions, establishing that doubt itself is not an error, but the foundational engine of human progress. The path kept demanding more resilience. We learned through Marcus's routine that wisdom blossoms in small moments, the quiet discipline of waking early, observing and noting emotional impulses before they become entrenched judgments. This practice taught us a profound separation. There are merely events occurring, and then there is our inner judgment about those events. The power lay in the space between the stimulus and the reaction, the refusal to agree immediately. Our advanced study led us to detachment itself, realizing that much of human suffering stems not from the external storm, but from the story we attach to it, the unexamined assumption that things must be a certain way. The journey expanded beyond self-containment. We were drawn into the complexity of the community, understanding that true virtue is never an isolated project. It demands friction. It requires navigating the difficult, necessary currents of relationship with others. Our focus shifted from simply mastering ourselves to building character, to becoming something through continuous, deliberate action, as Aristotle taught. Self-mastery, we found, was not a destination achieved by insight alone, but a physical habit, built up day by arduous day by consistently choosing the difficult, virtuous path. Then came Socrates' mirror. Here, all philosophy reached its sharpest point of clarity and greatest confusion. The mirror demanded more than mere intellectual understanding. It required honesty about what we truly thought, even when that thought was uncomfortable or contradictory. We learned that persistent self-examination is the highest form of freedom. It means embracing ambiguity, the continuous state of questioning itself, and refusing to let ourselves settle into any fixed belief, whether positive or negative. The ultimate realization, however, came with radical presence. The mind has a habit of living in porous dimensions, worrying about what might be, and regretting what was. This internal time travel is exhausting, destructive. True freedom, therefore, lies in the discipline of attention, anchoring ourselves fully into the moment we inhabit. To work at a craft, to walk through a landscape, to simply observe the light, these acts train us to find our entire existence housed only within the immediate now. The past does not exist outside of memory, and the future is an invention. Neither possesses material weight. This discipline of presence quieted the relentless internal monologue, teaching acceptance not as passive resignation, but as active engagement with reality exactly as it unfolds. The accumulating wisdom began to feel too heavy, too serious. We approached the final lesson armed with monumental concepts: duty, virtue, time, and self. Yet, standing at the precipice of our supposed ultimate understanding, a different, unexpected insight emerged: the philosophical humor. The traveler realized that in his relentless striving for profound meaning, he had built an elaborate drama around simple life moments. His intense pursuit had become its own source of unnecessary emotional weight. Wisdom, it turned out, requires abandoning dramatic seriousness. It means seeing the great questions not as terrifying metaphysical crises, but perhaps as little more than light-hearted human melodrama. And so, we arrived at synthesis. We understood that philosophy is not a grand edifice built to hold absolute truth. There is no final chapter, no crowning achievement of wisdom awaiting us after all this grueling intellectual climb. To believe such an ending exists would be the ultimate error, the greatest act of conceptual stagnation. Philosophy, truly, is simply the gentle, continuous act of asking better questions about ourselves and our world. It is the endless process itself. The journey ends not with a perfect answer, but with the recommitment to perpetual curiosity. We must live as students, forever poised at the threshold of understanding, eternally ready to doubt the assumptions we once held most sacred. This ceaseless questioning, this humble ambiguity,